Chapter 22. National Differences in Wages. In Chapter 17, we were concerned with the manifold combinations which may bring about a change in the magnitude of the value of labor power, this magnitude being considered either absolutely or relatively, i.e. as compared with surplus value. We found also that the quantity of the means of subsistence in which the price of labor power was realized might again undergo fluctuations independent of or different from the changes in this price. As has been said already, the simple translation of the value, or respectively of the price of labor power, into the exoteric form of wages transforms all these laws into laws governing the movement of wages. What appears within the movement of wages as a series of varying combinations may appear for different countries as a set of simultaneous differences in national wage levels. In comparing wages in different nations, we must therefore take into account all the factors that determine changes in the amount of the value of labor power. The price and extent of the prime necessities of life in their natural and historical development, the cost of training the workers, the part played by the labor of women and children, the productivity of labor, and its extensive and intensive magnitudes. Even the most superficial comparison requires the prior reduction of the average daily wage for the same trades in different countries to a uniform working day. After this reduction of the daily wage to the same terms, the time wage must again be translated into the piece wage, as only the latter can be a measure of both the productivity and of the intensity of labor. In every country, there is a certain average intensity of labor, below which the labor for the production of a commodity requires more than the time socially necessary and therefore does not count as labor of normal quality. In a given country, only a degree of intensity which is above the national average alters the measurement of value by the mere duration of labor time. It is otherwise on the world market, whose integral parts are the individual countries. The average intensity of labor changes from country to country. Here it is greater, there less. These national averages form a scale whose unit of measurement is the average unit of universal labor. The more intense national labor, therefore, as compared with the less intense, produces in the same time more value, which expresses itself in more money. But the law of value is yet more modified in its international application by the fact that, on the world market, national labor which is more productive also counts as more intensive, as long as the more productive nation is not compelled by competition to lower the selling prices of its commodities to the level of their value. In proportion as capitalist production is developed in a country, so in the same proportion do the national intensity and productivity of labor there rise above the international level. The different quantities of commodities of the same kind produced in different countries in the same working time have, therefore, unequal international values, which are expressed in different prices, i.e. in sums of money varying according to international values. The relative value of money will therefore be less in the nation with a more developed capitalist mode of production than in the nation with a less developed capitalism. It follows then that nominal wages, the equivalent of labor power expressed in money, will also be higher in the first nation than in the second, but this by no means proves that the same can be said of real wages, i.e. the means of subsistence placed at the disposal of the worker. But even apart from these relative differences in the value of money in different countries, it'll frequently be found that the daily or weekly wage in the first nation is higher than in the second, while the relative price of labor, i.e. the price of labor as compared both with surplus value and with the value of the product, stands higher in the second than in the first. J.W. Cowell, a member of the Factory Commission of 1833, came to the conclusion, after careful investigation of the spinning trade, that, quote, in England, wages are virtually lower to the capitalist, though higher to the operative than on the continent of Europe. The English factory inspector Alexander Redgrave, in his report of the 31st October 1866, proves, by comparing the statistics of continental states, that in spite of lower wages and much longer hours of work, continental labor is, in proportion to the product, dearer than English. The English manager of a cotton factory in Oldenburg declared that the working hours there were from 5:30 a.m. to 8 p.m., Saturdays included, and that the workers, when under English overseers, did not supply during this time quite so much of the product as the English in 10 hours, while they supplied much less when under German overseers. Wages are much lower than in England, in many cases lower by 50%, but the number of hands in proportion to the machinery is much greater, in certain departments in proportions of 5 to 3. Mr. Redgrave also gives very precise details as to the Russian cotton factories. The data were given to him by an English manager until recently employed there. On this Russian soil, so fruitful of all infamies, the old horrors of the early days of English factories are in full swing. The managers are, of course, English, as the native Russian capitalist is incapable of handling factory business. Despite all the overwork, which continues throughout the day and the night, despite the most shameful underpayment of the workers, Russian manufacturing only manages to vegetate thanks to the prohibition of foreign competition. I give in conclusion a comparative table of Mr. Redgrave's on the average number of spindles per factory and per spinner in the different countries of Europe. He himself remarks that these figures were collected a few years ago, and that since that time the size of the factories and the number of spindles per worker in England has increased. He assumes, however, that an approximately equal advance has been made in the continental countries mentioned, so that the numbers given would still retain their value for the purposes of comparison. The average number of spindles per factory in England, 12,600, in France, 1,500, in Prussia, 1,500, in Belgium, 4,000, in Saxony, 4,500, in Austria, 7,000, and in Switzerland, 8,000. The average number of spindles per person. In France, there's 1 person to 14 spindles, in Russia, 1 person to 28, in Prussia, 37, Bavaria, 46, Austria, 49, Belgium, 50, Saxony, 50, Switzerland, 55, the smaller German states, 55, and Great Britain, 74. This comparison, says Mr. Redgrave, is yet more unfavorable to Great Britain, inasmuch as there is so large a number of factories in which weaving by power is carried on in conjunction with spinning, while in the table the weavers are not deducted, and the factories abroad are chiefly spinning factories. If it were possible to compare like with like strictly, I could find many cotton spinning factories in my district in which mules containing 2,200 spindles are minded by 1 man and 2 assistants only, turning off daily 220 pounds of yarn measuring 400 miles in length. It is well known that in Eastern Europe, as well as in Asia, English companies have undertaken the construction of railways and have, in making them, employed a certain number of English workers side by side with the locals. Practical necessity has thus compelled them to take into account the national differences in the intensity of labor, but this has not brought them any loss. Their experience shows that even if the level of wages more or less corresponds with the average intensity of labor, the relative price of labor, i.e. the price of labor in relation to the product, generally varies in the inverse direction. In an essay on the rate of wages, one of his first economic writings, H. Carey tries to prove that differences in national wage levels are directly proportional to the degree of productivity of the working day of each nation, in order to draw from this international ratio the deduction that wages everywhere rise and fall in proportion to the productivity of labor. The whole of our analysis of the production of surplus value shows that this deduction would be absurd even if Carey himself had demonstrated his premise, instead of shuffling a confused mass of statistical material to and fro in his usual uncritical and superficial manner. The best of all is that he does not assert that things actually are as they ought to be according to his theory. For state intervention has falsified the natural economic relation. The different national wages must therefore be calculated on the assumption that the part of them that goes to the state in the form of taxes was received by the worker himself. Ought not Mr. Carey to consider further whether these state expenses are not the natural fruits of capitalist development? His reasoning is quite worthy of the man who, first of all, declared that the capitalist relations of production were eternal laws of nature and reason, whose free and harmonious working was only disturbed by the intervention of the state, and then discovered afterwards that state intervention, i.e. the defense of those laws of nature and reason by the state, alias the system of production, was necessitated by the diabolical influence of England on the world market, an influence which, it appears, does not spring from the natural laws of capitalist production. He discovered further that the theorems of Ricardo and others, in which existing social antagonisms and contradictions are formulated, are not the ideal product of the real economic movement, but, on the contrary, that the real antagonisms of capitalist production, in England and elsewhere, are the result of the theories of Ricardo and others. Finally, he discovered that it is, in the last resort, trade which destroys the inborn beauties and harmonies of the capitalist mode of production. A step further, and he will perhaps discover that the one evil in capitalist production is capital itself. Only a man with such an atrocious lack of the critical faculty and such spurious erudition deserved, in spite of the protectionist heresy, to become the secret source of the harmonious wisdom of a Bastiat and of all the other free trade optimists of the present day. End of Part 6.